insurance mathematics. My name is Katrien Antonio, and today I'm going to cover multi-population mortality models, and more specifically, we're going to focus on the mortality standard models, or the mortality standards, which recently have been developed by the Dutch Actuarial Association in the Netherlands and the Institute of Actuaries in Belgium. And you see that the title of my presentation here refers to the acronyms which are used to denote these mortality projection models and the mortality projection tables that have been developed by these respective actuarial associations in Belgium and in the Netherlands. So when you see here the acronym AG, that stands in Dutch for the Actuarieel Genootschap, or the Actuarial Association in the Netherlands, and the IABA stands for the Institute of Actuaries in Belgium. And these different professional bodies have published mortality models, projected mortality models, back in 2014, in 2015, 16, 2018. So you'll see that the Dutch Association publishes an update of their model and the results every 2 years. And for the Institute of Actuaries in Belgium, a new update is being prepared currently in 2020 and will soon become available. So let's see what we want to do here. If we look at the mission statements, that the working parties who worked on these mortality projection models within these actuarial associations, if you look at the mission statement that these working parties got, then we can summarize it as follows. So the goal of a working party on mortality in a professional actuarial body is to develop a state-of-the-art mortality projection model and the resulting mortality projection table using the most recently available data on number of deaths and exposure to risk in years for the country, for the population under investigation, but perhaps also for related populations. The mortality projection model, of course, must be designed using suitable state-of-the-art methodology. It must document all assumptions, calibration and simulation details, and that last part of the mission statement, that is of course included to make sure that the mortality projection model and its results are fully reproducible by actuaries in the industry, in insurance companies and pension funds who want to use this mortality projection model in their daily work. Now, if we look at the single population mortality models that a working party or a group of researchers, actuaries, thinking about designing a suitable mortality projection model, if we think at the group of single population models that one could take into consideration when looking for a state-of-the-art model for a specific population, then we can say that there is this general class of stochastic mortality projection models that we could start from, and I label them here in my presentation as the LifeMetrics models. And that name goes back to a project sponsored by JP Morgan in the UK, where the goal as well was to investigate the use of several stochastic mortality projection models and to produce meaningful models that can be used in the insurance industry, in the pension fund industry. And so within this LifeMetrics models, researchers have been looking into models which use different kinds of parameters to capture the trends to capture the evolution in mortality rates over time for specific ages. And you see these models being listed here, being described here in a very general setting. So we'll see that these models could either be specified at the level of the logarithm of the force of mortality for an individual age x in period t. And if we look at the specification that you see over here, we see that these mortality models will rely on let's say, three major groups of parameters. You see the parameters being indicated in red, which are age dependent, denoted here with beta x1 up to beta xn. Then we have the parameters in black, which are all time dependent, and we include up to n of such parameters in our specification. Those are the kappa t1 up to the kappa tn. And then we have the cohort parameters. So that's something new. That's something we haven't met or discussed yet. So these are parameters gamma, which are indexed here with t minus x. So that is the birth year of the individual who's x year old in year t. It's the birth year or the cohort to which this individual belongs. And then you see that the gammas here from with superscript from 1 running up to n, these gammas capture cohort-specific effects. So for instance, I myself, I belong to the cohort born in the year 1981. So that means that for me, and this gamma parameter for the cohort 1981 would be used in a specification for my applicable mortality, force of mortality. Now, so these are the major building blocks that we use in the specification of these LifeMetrics models. As I already mentioned, we can build these models at the level of the logarithm of the force of mortality, or we could use the logit of the mortality rate, the QXT, and use the parametric specification of the single population stochastic mortality model at the level of this logit of QXT. So once again, we have the beta axis, which is the age effect for hx, corresponding to component or building block k in the model, where k can run from 1 up to capital N. We have the kappa t, which is the period effect for period t in component k. Once again, component k can run from 1 up to n. And we have the gamma t minus xk, which is the cohort parameter corresponding to birth year or cohort t minus x. And again, we have up to n possible components in this, the general specification of our models. So we could have up to n such building blocks using cohort-specific parameters. Right. Now you may wonder, why do we have these two possible specifications with either the logarithm of the mu or with the logit of QXT? So let's motivate that using my iPad screen. So let's see what we can, how we can make sense out of that. So here we are. So remember for that in the previous lecture, we derived the so-called survival likelihood. And we showed in the previous lecture that this survival likelihood that we designed, that we put together, is proportional to a Poisson likelihood, right? So if you think about designing a stochastic mortality model, then you're going to think about which random variable do I want to model, and which model specification, distributional assumption, but also specification of the mean parameter in this distributional assumption, which specifications, which assumptions am I going to make? And therefore you have two options. So that is, if you work with the number of deaths at hx in period t for a specific country and a specific gender, then you can, or then two very common assumptions in the literature is that either you're going to say this number of deaths follows a Poisson distribution with as the mean parameter the exposure at hx in period t multiplied with the force of mortality, right? So that's what we derived in the previous class. So now you see that the logarithm of this mu xt can be specified using the LifeMetrics, very general class of LifeMetrics models, which we introduced on the sheet. So this is what we get for our LifeMetrics models, which we wish to consider here. Yeah. So I've got, for the final part, I've got the gamma t minus x. Okay. But now if you look into the literature on stochastic mortality models, you will also see a different type of specification being used. And it is, you're going to assume that the number of deaths at hx in period t is not following a Poisson distribution, but is following a binomial distribution. And we've encountered this binomial likelihood already in the previous lectures when we were discussing the calibration of mortality loss. So you can use that over here as well. You're going to assume the number of deaths follows a binomial distribution. Lambda xt is sort of the number of experiments or trials, and the probability of dying, the 1 year probability of dying, that's my qxt. Now, of course, this qxt is a number between 0 and 1, right? It's a probability. And so when we build a parametric model for probability, we're often going to use this logit transformation. So that is the logarithm of qxt divided by 1 minus qxt. And we're going to use the LifeMetrics specification for this logit transformation of the mortality rate, qxt. So that motivates why we have both specifications or both possibilities being shown on the screen, and both models make sense. In the course, we have a preference to go for this number 1, for the Poisson likelihood. So that's the one that we will be using. But remember, and there are other researchers out there, there's literature out there with this binomial distribution. And this binomial assumption is going to be used extensively. Okay, so that's important to keep in mind. All right, returning to the lecture sheets. So here is my general class of models. So my mission could now be that if I want to design such a single population mortality model, then I would have to make meaningful choices from this broad class of models that I could possibly design to establish, to calibrate, to design a stochastic mortality model for the population that I have in mind, right? And perhaps before we move on, let's link, or let's explicitly show the link between the Lee-Carter specification, which we already explored, and the very general class of models that we introduced on the previous sheet. So a very well-known specification, which fits within the class of LifeMetrics models, that's the Lee-Carter model. You see it printed here on the sheet in terms of the logarithm of the force of mortality. So we have an age-specific parameter beta x1. We have an age-specific parameter beta x2, which we multiply with a time-dependent or a period-dependent parameter kappa t2, right? Often you also see that being denoted with just alpha x plus beta x times kappa t. That's of course exactly the same thing. It's just a matter of using a slightly different notation. Yeah? So this Lee-Carter model, that's a baseline model, and it fits within this general class of LifeMetrics models that we introduced earlier. Dependence on age is governed here by the beta x1 and the beta x2, and the time dynamics are captured by the kappa 2 parameters. Okay. Now, if we look at the literature, the stochastic mortality literature, then we see that people have been working with a lot of different models, which fit, once again, within this general class of LifeMetrics models. And you see them being listed over here. I label each of the models that I took from the literature and included in this overview. I label each of those models with M and then a certain number. So you see on sheet 9, we go from M1 up to M8. And then on the next sheet, we continue with M9 up to M40. Yeah. Now, what are the general takeaways from this overview? Well, first of all, if you look at these 3 models that I colored here in blue, that's the Lee-Carter baseline model, right? It's an extension of, and then we continue with extensions of Lee-Carter. For instance, extending Lee-Carter by including a cohort effect. Yeah? So that's the gamma t minus x3 that you see over here. And this model, the resulting model, is the Renshaw and Haberman model, published in 2006, which even multiplies this cohort parameter cohort effect with an age-specific effect beta x3, right? So this goes beyond Lee-Carter and says, well, we want to extend Lee-Carter by also including a parameter gamma where I calibrate such a gamma parameter for each birth year that I consider in my data set. So there are some specific effects that correspond to the birth year, the year of birth, the year in which I was born, which drives somehow the mortality that I observe for a specific cohort of individuals that is followed. Yeah. If you then look, how do we go from Renshaw and Haberman to the Curie model? Well, there you see that, there you clearly see the Renshaw-Haberman specification coming back, but it's a bit simplified in the sense that we don't include free parameters beta x2 and beta x3, but we replace them with observable constants, in this case NA, which is the number of ages considered in my data set, in the data set on which I calibrate this model. So these are three essential models. It's Lee Carter with a little tweak, and the tweak is in terms of adding this cohort parameters. Then you see a different set of models labeled here with M5 up to M8. These are the so-called Kearns-Blake-Dowd mortality models, so the CBD models, which have been proposed for the logit of the QXT, and which, as you see over here, are going to use multiple time-dependent parameters, so kappa T1 and kappa T2, and the kappas here are multiplied with observable covariates. In this case, covariates that I can express in terms of the age under consideration. For instance, x minus x bar, where x bar would be the average age in my data set. That's the basis or the baseline CBD model, which has then been extended by adding additional parameters, for instance, a cohort effect once again, or something to capture even more time dynamics and their interaction with specific age effects. So something peculiar or a little bit special to keep in mind for these CBD models is that they really have been designed to capture the mortality behavior of the mortality rates that correspond to pensioner ages. Yeah? So it doesn't make sense to fit these CBD models over the whole age range from newborns to old age mortality. No, you're typically only going to use these CBD models from a retirement age on, let's say from age 60 or something, and you're going to use these models to capture really the aging process and the rather old or the pensioner age mortality. That's important to keep in mind. And then a final set of models start with the plot model proposed by Richard Plot in 2009, which sort of combines the best of both worlds in the sense that ideas from Lee Carter are combined with the ideas from the CBD model, right? So this is a kind of CBD model which does make sense for the whole age range because you've got this age-specific intercept, the beta x1, included in this model. So we see in the plot specification, we've got the beta x1 capturing age-specific effects. We've got the kappa T2, kappa T3, kappa T4 capturing time-dependent effects, and we've got the cohort parameters, the gamma T minus x. Other researchers have continued this idea launched by Richard Plot and extended, tweaked the original model specification using slightly different covariates, essentially, right? I also want to point out that this idea of starting with a kind of baseline stochastic mortality model, let it be the Lee Carter or let it be CBD, and extending that model by adding extra terms in order to try to capture specific phenomena or specific trends in your mortality data. Well, we've seen that same idea being used as well in the literature on parametric mortality laws, which we discussed earlier on, because there as well we started with a very simple baseline model, the Gompertz or the Macon parametric mortality model, and we extended that simple parametric mortality law by adding extra terms, ending up with a model as complicated as the Heligman-Pollard parametric mortality law, for instance. So you see, you see a parallel between that literature and how that literature evolved and what we see here in the stochastic mortality modeling literature. Okay. So having a list of these different models available, of course, if you would look at the activities then of a working party or a group that was committed within these actuarial associations to design a new stochastic mortality projection model, then of course the first step into the activities of such a working party, bringing together people from research with people from industry, would be to try out to calibrate these different models, which we listed on the previous sheet, on the population of interest. And I'm now going to summarize a couple of findings based on, let's say, my own experience with calibrating these different mortality models on a single population, let it be the Belgian population or the Dutch population. So we'll see that identifiability issues pop up. We already discussed the identifiability issues within the Carter, and we also proposed constraints to tackle those identifiability issues. But we see here that when we dive into models as complicated as M9, that these identifiability issues become really way harder, right? And that even for some of these models in the original publications, in the original research papers, the identifiability issues were initially not tackled in the appropriate way, right? So it really becomes tricky to figure out which constraints do I need, which issues am I facing, and which constraints should I propose to fix those, right? Another thing that we could comment on is that if you look at the more complicated models, they typically use, let's say, up to 3 time-dependent parameters, kappa T2, kappa T3, kappa T4. So you have a 3-dimensional time series model that you need to think about and that you will have to propose and have to calibrate. So that again becomes rather difficult, let's say. So this is something to keep in mind when you will propose a mortality projection model to be used in the industry. And then regarding these cohort effects, so what we see is that if we calibrate these gamma T minus X parameters, if we calibrate them to, let's say, the Dutch population or the Belgian population, perhaps some others, then what we often encounter are some jumps or irregularities in the calibrated cohort effects, which has then, and this problem has been solved, if you want, or what researchers have been doing with this problem is often that they ignore or they leave out estimated cohort effects for which there are not enough observations available. So think about very recent cohorts, and the cohort born in 2010, the cohort born in 2011. You could say, let's leave out those estimated cohort effects. If there are not enough observations available, let's leave them out of the time series that you get for the calibrated cohort effects, and let's only build a time series model on those cohort effects, estimated cohort effects, for which I have a sufficient amount of exposure years available. So this is a bit of an ad hoc strategy, and we also see that even if you agree with this ad hoc strategy, that the forecasting of cohort effects could be really difficult, and some researchers even decide not to do that at all, right? So not even try to attempt to find a meaningful forecasting model for the calibrated gamma parameters. And of course, when would you need such a forecasted gamma parameter? If you want to say something about the life expectancy, for instance, for a newborn in the future. So somebody who will belong to a future yet unobserved cohort, a baby born in 2021, 2022, you would need a new gamma parameter for a newborn in that in these specific cohorts. So you would need to forecast the cohort effect belonging to or corresponding to future birth years. Yeah? So these are all some difficulties that we want to keep in mind. And if we look at what eventually then the actuarial associations in Belgium and in the Netherlands proposed as the model to work with, or to work with and to propose as a mortality projection standard, well, then we're going to enter the literature on multiple population mortality, right? So what we're going to do here is we're going to combine the data from multiple populations, yet to be defined, which populations that should be. And we're going to use models like, for instance, the Lee model, proposed in 2005, also called the augmented common factor model. So what you see here is that for a set of European countries that has to be specified, so I leave it very open here, we're going to combine the data and we're going to propose to model the data for country I, hx period t, using a model that is built up or that uses two Lee-Carter specifications. So in blue you recognize a Lee-Carter model with ax, bx, kt, and in red you recognize another Lee-Carter model, but this Lee-Carter model takes a superscript I, so it is specific to country I under investigation. Whereas the blue parameters, these are shared by all the countries in my dataset. So in this case, the European countries that I wish to model together, they all share this, these blue parameters and these common parameters. So the AX, the BX, and the KT, they capture here the overall European mortality trends, so to say, right? And the red guys, they capture how country I is deviating from this shared European trend in mortality. So that's the idea here. You combine multiple populations, you collect their data, and you're going to model the logarithm of the force of mortality of country I for hx period t by saying, well, there is a part that comes from a European model, and there is a part that is shared by all the countries in my in the data set that I'm considering, right? That's captured here in blue. And then I have a country-specific deviation from this common mortality model, from the common European mortality model. Okay, so that's important. We do twice a Lee-Carter specification. And of course, this idea of designing multi-population mortality models, this is not restricted to combining the Lee-Carter model twice. And we can do that for any of the mortality specification models that are listed in my overview. And so you can combine any model MX for the blue parts, which is shared by the European countries, with any other mortality model and mortality specification model MY that is capturing, or that should capture then the country-specific deviation from this European mortality model. Yeah, so you could do, for instance, a plot model, or you could do a CBD plot model, or you can come up with any type of combination that makes sense technically and biologically to you. But I'm going to say here that we experimented with different types of such multi-population mortality models, but decided to go for this Lee specification, as you see it here on the screen. Right? And the reason why we went for this Lee model is by launching a comparative study where you would try different single and multiple population mortality models, and where you would evaluate the performance based on a list of evaluation criteria, so a checklist that you think capture the essential parts, the essential items or missions that your preferred stochastic mortality model should fulfill. So we looked at biological reasonableness. Do I get reasonable fits in sample but are also out of sample? How robust is my model? If I would use a different calibration period, if I would calibrate on a different age range, if I would make changes to the set of countries that I'm going to use, how robust is my model to such changes? How well is my model performing statistically? So think about information criteria, AIC, BIC, that you want to evaluate across different models, and where you want to go for a model that brings you that sort of optimizes your information criteria. What if I put together an out-of-sample exercise? So let's say that I'm going to do a backtest using the data only up to a certain year. Say use the data up to 2005, build the model, calibrate the model, and project the years 2006 up to 2019. So how well does my model then predict the actual observations for the years that I did not use, that I left aside as a test set to evaluate my model? Okay. We also should be able to generate future scenarios of mortality, such that we can combine these with scenarios for interest rates and quantify the uncertainty that comes with these with such scenarios. Okay, so we'll come back to the session. So what we're going to do now is use this Lee model specification for multi-population mortality. We're going to use it as the proposed model specification for the projection models developed by the actuarial associations in the Netherlands and in Belgium, right? And the reason why that particular model was chosen from a more elaborate comparative study where different mortality model specifications, both for single population as well as multi-population mortality data were investigated, is because this Lee model turned out to perform very well upon using the criteria, the evaluation criteria that I have on this particular sheet. So we calibrated different models and compared the different models based on their biological reasonableness. So if you look at the fitted values for the mortality rates, do these make sense? If you look at projections, do these make sense? How robust is the model? So is the model very sensitive to, for instance, the choices that I make for the calibration period, or the choice that I make for the ages that are used in the model? So robustness issues are important. And then the next model selection criteria that we use are, of course, statistical measures. So if you look at information criteria like AIC, PIC, if you look at out of sample or out of time projection or prediction errors, how do models perform based on these, and so on and so forth. What about the ability to generate future scenarios of mortality? So that is, of course, very important because we want to use the stochastic mortality model to project scenarios for the future. So an important evaluation criterion is then, of course, how realistic are these scenarios, and is the model able to come up with realistic scenarios, right? So if you make a list of, like a kind of checklist using all these criteria, and if you then calibrate different models and see how they perform based on this checklist that you put together, then the working parties of the Dutch and the Belgian association factories decided to go for this Lee model specification, right? Sheets is to see how to calibrate this model and then how to use the model to project future scenarios. So here is Jonathan's question. So Jonathan asked if we get these selection of European countries and we want to calibrate the Lee model using a group of European countries, well, how specifically will you define this group of countries? So what we did in this work is we select the European countries with a GDP per capita above the average of the Euro area. And the idea is that Belgium and the Netherlands are above the average of the Euro area, or at least they were at the time of writing. So we're going to use all the European countries which belong to that same group, defined based on this, let's say, economic criterion or socio-economic criterion. Now, of course, as we discussed earlier on, you can also propose other qualitative measures to select a group of countries that you want to combine. You could also look into more data-driven or machine learning kind of techniques to select these countries. All of that is possible, but here we have a simple selection. So you can look at characteristics or tables published by the World Bank or something, and you can look at the group of countries who perform or who have a GDP per capita above the average of the Euro area. And here you see at the time of writing what that group of countries was. So these, the mortality data from these different countries were put together and were used to calibrate this LME specification. Now you see a couple of things that you perhaps want to take into account here. So you see West Germany, which is not the whole of Germany, it is West Germany, because that has to do, of course, with the unification of Germany. So we'll see that in more recent publications of the model of the Actuarial Association in the Netherlands, and also the data from East Germany have been used. And so there you have some choices that you have to make, whether you're only going to use the data on West Germany, the historical data on West Germany, or use the whole country. That's something that you would have to look into. Similar kind of reasoning for the UK, where what we're going to use here is England and Wales. Yeah? So of course you can make other choices, but these are, because these countries have some particularities historically. So there you have to look into that a bit and make a choice about how to use their historical data. So this is what we used at the time of writing the initial model for the Dutch Association and the model for the Belgian Actuarial Association. Yeah. So for the group of countries, we got the data on deaths and exposures from 1970 until, yeah, a certain, I write here 2009, but of course, when you would do the exercise right now, you would have to look into that. But the idea here is that you go to the human mortality database and that you're going to see, let us start in 1970, and let us look until which date, until which year, do I find the published statistics for the whole set of 14 countries, until which year can I find for all of them the most recent available data on the human mortality, database, right? And of course, not all countries are have the same speed in publishing these statistics on the website of the human mortality database. So it can be possible that, for instance, for Belgium, you will find the data until 2018 or 19 even on the human mortality data base, whereas for another country, for instance Luxembourg, that is a couple of years behind Belgium in getting their statistics on this website. So the idea is here, use that same source of information as long as possible, right? And then of course we can add more recent country-specific data by looking at publications by national statistics institutes, for instance, the CBS, the Central Bureau for Statistics in the Netherlands, or the Federal Planbureau, or the National Institute for Statistics in Belgium, something like that. So there typically we have more recent country-specific data online. So when we want to collect as much information as possible on these 14 identified countries, then we're going to combine these different sources where we can find data and statistics. I'm going to add a few words on that later. Yeah. So here the 14 countries will be used to calibrate the Lee Carter model printed in blue on my previous sheet. So this will be used to calibrate the common part of my mortality forecasting model. And then of course the country-specific data will be used to estimate parameters in red, to estimate the country-specific Carter model and parameters. That's the idea. All right. So that being said, what is kind of the motivation to use these countries as well? So we've seen this. We've seen both pictures earlier on in the course. So what we have here is the evolution of the period life expectancy for the different countries in our study. So we have the female data on the left, and we have the male data on the right. And we start here quite early, so we start in 1920, but we see that for the calibration period that we identified, so from 1917 on, that the life or the evolutions in the period life expectancies for these 14 countries that we put together, that these evolutions are quite parallel, if you want. So we have a convergence here in terms of the evolution of the period life expectancy for the different countries in our multi-population model. And that's also an underlying motivation. So it seems to make sense. So it seems to make sense to say that these countries have a similar mortality experience or a similar evolution in their mortality rates. Yeah? So we've seen this picture earlier on, and now you also know why we particularly put this set of countries in the graph, because these are the 14 countries that were combined into these mortality projection models by the Dutch and the Belgian actuarial associations. Yeah? And the convergent trend from 1970 on, that also motivates more or less the calibration period that was used for the Lilly model. Of course, that's another choice that you have to make, so it's not a very hard or solid criterion, but we would say here, yeah, from 1970 on, we see this parallel movement. We're going to start from there. Now, a small comment that I want to make is that I mentioned that we're going to combine data from different sources. So perhaps you find a lot of information on the website of the Human Mortality Database, but perhaps you need to combine that with statistics being published by national institutes to get the most recently available data. Well, then a very important comment is that different sources of mortality data may use different ways to publish these data. And what you see here is a snapshot from a paper that I wrote with Sander de Vriend in 2017 for the European Actuarial Journal, which is on your reading list and which I will discuss later on. But on the left, you see what the Human Mortality Database is doing, and on the right, you see what the Federal Planbureau in Belgium is using, right? So they sort of count the deaths and the exposure in different ways. You can do it in a square way, that's the vision on the left. You can use it you can do that in a parallel way or parallelogram way, that's on the right. So whenever you're going to combine data from different sources, you have to make sure that you're going to do a kind of transformation such that when you collect data along the cohort or the parallelogram setting, that you're going to transform these data such that they are compatible with the way how, in this case, the Human Mortality Database is using the data. Yeah? So I don't want to go into the very technical details here, but I just want to give the comment that different institutes who publish data may use different definitions. And so it's a matter of seeing, of observing, like if I get information from Eurostat or from the Federal Planbureau or from the Human Mortality Database, how is that constructed? And do I need to make some transformations to put these different sources together? So the more technical details are are sketched in our journal paper. And for those who are really interested in that, you can find them over there. Okay. Any questions? Okay, so we sketched the data. So we said, okay, this is how we selected the countries. This is some motivation. in terms of the convergence of the period life expectancies. I mentioned the possible differences in the underlying definitions, right? And what you see over here is, yeah, it's essentially the difference between smaller countries and bigger countries. So here you see for, I think for the model that was published by the Belgian Institute of Actuaries, 2015, we made the graphs over here. Again, you've got these 14 different countries. And you see here, for instance, if you look at the exposures on the right here, you see here that, of course, Germany, in particular West Germany in this case, is taking a big share of the total number of observations that we put together, followed by France, by England and Wales, by the Netherlands, then comes Belgium, and so on and so forth, right? So this is a bit the difference between the big countries in your group of countries and the smaller ones. On the right, you see this in terms of the exposure to risk, and on the left, you see this in terms of the number of deaths registered at different ages. Yeah. So this is for the whole volume of data. And this, yeah, it's a sentence in Dutch, but you see here that we have in total about 11 billion years of exposure and over 100 millions of deaths being registered. And that's, of course, one of the big advantages of working with such a multi-population mortality model, that you can leverage the number of data or the number of observations, exposure to risk that you're using in order to increase the robustness of the model that you're calibrating. But I will come back to that. Okay. A few points, comments in terms of the data that are being used. So I refer here to the model of the Dutch Association. So you see, we started this project 2014. Then we published an update 2016, and even in 2018, another update was published, so every 2 years. So in terms of changes, we see that originally we started with England and Wales, but later on this was replaced by using the data from the whole United Kingdom. Originally, we only used the data from West Germany, and data for East Germany were included from 1990, right? So the choices that we make, they're of course not static, so we try to evaluate those choices every time we publish an update on these models. And as you see here, 2 adjustments were made throughout this process. Yeah. So in terms of the work of the Dutch Association of Actuaries, so I participated in the original study in 2014. But I was no longer a member of the working group in 2016-18, and this working group, yeah, that combines academics, so people working in actuarial science from universities, combines them with actuaries working in consulting firms, actuaries working in pension funds, and so on and so forth. So it was really an interaction between academia and industry in this process of putting this mortality standards together. Right? What kind of data sources were used? So the human mortality database. Later on, we also used Eurostat. So I put new here, but that means we used it from 2016 on. CBS, so that's to get the most recent data for the Netherlands. For Belgium, you can go there for the Federal Plan to find the most recent. And of course, once again, when you're combining different sources of information, you always have to be careful about how are those data constructed. So is this the square thinking, or is this the parallelogram kind of thinking, and how should I treat these different pieces of information? Okay, so that was in terms of the data. Any questions on that? Any feedback? Anything at all? So everybody's still there? Still okay? Technically? Right. Everything okay? Thank you. So let's go on now with the calibration methodology, right? Because that's something we haven't explained yet. So what we're going to do is we're going to use maximum likelihood estimation. We're going to use our Poisson likelihood. So the reason why we do that is because we are aware of this connection between the Poisson likelihood and the survival likelihood that we derived earlier on in the course. So we're going to go for this Poisson approach, right? And if you remember how we calibrated the Lee-Carter model, well, for Lee-Carter, what we proposed was the number of deaths at hx in period t is Poisson distributed, with as the mean of my Poisson distribution, my exposure to risk at hx period t, multiplied with the force of mortality at hx period t. And this force of mortality was then written as the exponential function evaluated in my Lee-Carter specification, right? And I write it here with an alpha x and a beta x and kappa t, but that's just a matter of the notation that I'm using. So I want to use the same idea, but now use it to calibrate this Lee specification, this multi-population mortality model. Okay. So again, dxt is the number of deaths as a random variable. ext is my corresponding exposure at risk. So we know that, and we want to see how we can do this with Lee. So one of the assumptions that we make, and that we introduced already earlier on, is that we have this constant, or I should say piecewise constant, force of mortality that gives me the connection between my mortality rate, qxt, and the force of mortality, which is my muxt, right? So that's a connection I'm aware of. If I express, or if I build a model for the mu, then I can always apply this transformation and rephrase the model or get the corresponding estimate for the mortality rate qxt from it, right? So we're going to work here, and what is now a little bit peculiar is that, of course, I want to calibrate these two parts in my model. I want to work with the specification, the Lee-Carter specification, at the European level, and that's what I denote here with the EU. So this is my common mortality specification, right? That's the European model that is using the parameters AX, BX, and KT in capitals. And then I want to capture a sort of country-specific deviation from this European mortality model. And that is captured with the mu tilde. And this mu tilde then relies on the parameters alpha xc, beta xc, and kappa tc, where the c refers to the specific country that I'm looking into, right? And if I multiply these two building blocks, then I got my country-specific mortality, force of mortality specification. So for instance, if I want to have the force of mortality for Belgium, hx period t, then I need to use the European mortality specification and multiply it with the Belgian deviation from this common trend, from this common mortality specification at European. So that's the way how I want to see this and how I want to use this model. Okay, I'm aware that there are some identifiability issues, and these identifiability issues are in line with what we saw for Lee-Carter. So we're going to impose that the sum of the KTs is 0, the sum of the kappa t's at country level is 0, the sum of the BX is 1, and the sum of the beta x's is also equal to 1, right? So we're going to see now how will I calibrate this model. And this is how we're going to do it. We're going to do it in 2 steps, and we're going to use Newton-Raphson or univariate Newton-Raphson steps as our underlying tool. And I'm going to do this procedure for each gender separately. So I'm going to do this for the male data, and then I'm going to repeat this for the female data, or vice versa. Yeah. So I'm going to fit this Lili, for each gender that I wish to consider separately. And the first step that I'm going to do is I'm going to get the parameters for the model at the European level. So I'm going to calibrate the AX, the BX, and the KT by using a likelihood for the European mortality. And what you see here, this likelihood specification, that is coming from a Poisson model at the European level, where the number of deaths, so the D that you see over here, is the total number of deaths across these 14 countries that I'm considering. And where the exposure to risk at European level is the sum of all the exposures that I have across these 14 countries for a specific HX and for a specific period T. So this sort of comes back to Ansfried's question earlier on, because I'm really aggregating the data here. I'm aggregating the data that I have for these 14 countries. I'm going to aggregate them per gender, per age, per period, and use their aggregate information as the D and the U in, the D and the E in this European likelihood. Correct? Is that okay? That first step, or any questions here? Does that make sense? Or do you want me to further clarify this? So the important thing to know here is you do a Poisson model for the mu at European level, and you're going to use as the input data the D's and the E's. These are aggregate data over all the 14 countries that you are willing to consider. Okay. Now the next step, well, if we look at this step, we can do Lee-Carter, and we can get the parameters AX, BX, and KT. We can get them from this likelihood, from optimizing this likelihood, right? In the next step, what we're then going to do is we're going to wonder, like, what if at the European level, I've got data for all these countries up to a certain year. Let's say I can find the data for all of them up to the year 2012, for instance, or 2009, as I had earlier on my sheet. But what if I have for the Netherlands or for Belgium, what if I have more recent data available for Belgium or for the Netherlands? Then I also would like to use these more recent data, right? I do not want to leave them behind. I want to use them, but I don't want to be limited by the fact that, for instance, for Norway or something, or for Sweden or for Iceland, I didn't have the data up to this specific year, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to use the data at European level as good as we can, right? And we're going to use the calibrated KTs calibrated for the European data. And then we're going to extrapolate these KTs linearly until the most recent year of data that we have available for Belgium or for the Netherlands, if that is necessary, if that is the case. Yeah? Because remember, if I'm using those KTs, then of course or if I want to use my more recent data for Belgium or for the Netherlands, then I also need these KTs until this specific year that I want to consider. Yeah. So even if I don't have those years for all the 14 countries, then I will do my best to calibrate the common trend, the KTs, using the years that I have observed for all these 14 European countries. And if I have for Belgium or for the Netherlands, I have more recent data available, then I'll just extrapolate my KTs along the linear trend that I fit at the European. So I'm going to come back to that, but that's the idea. And having this done, we will then calibrate the Lee-Carter parameters at the country level. So we're going to use the conditional likelihood for the country mortality, which is expressed in terms of the mu XTC. And what we're going to do here is we're going to use the observed deaths at the country level. So for country C, we're going to use the exposure to risk for country C. What we're going to use as the specification, as the mean specification in our Poisson model, we're going to use the country-specific exposure multiplied with the European force of mortality, multiplied with the country-specific deviation from this European trend, right? And the parameters, the alpha, the betas, and the kappas, these will be used in this tilde specification, in this country-specific deviation from the European trend. Yeah? So by using this Poisson likelihood, we're now capable of getting the alphas, the betas, and the kappas. So that means that the result of our step number 1 is kept fixed. So it's fixed as a kind of offset in our specification in step number 3, where we're only going to do the calibration over the country-specific parameters, the alphas, the betas, and the kappas. And that's the idea over here. And before taking questions, let us look at the result of these different steps for the European data, for the Netherlands, and for Belgium. So if you look at the first row of graphs, what you see over here are the Lee-Carter parameters, so the capital AX, the BX, and the kappa T, sorry, the KT, for the group of 14 countries that we put together. So you see here that this is capturing this overall pattern in the mortality rates. At the European level, we have our BX, so these capture how sensitive each HX is with respect to changes over time in the mortality, in the forces of mortality. And here we have the KT, which is capturing the evolution over time in our force of mortality. Yeah. And so what you see here is that the black line, the black solid line, is capturing the whole set of years for which we observed all the 14 countries in our multi-population study. And then you see here in red that we're going to extrapolate these KTs for a couple of extra years. And the reason there is that for Belgium or for the Netherlands, we have some more recent years of data available, and we also want to use those. So that's why we're going to extrapolate these KTs until the most recent year of data that we want to use for Belgium or for the Netherlands. Yeah. Then the second row of graphs here is capturing the parameters alpha X, the beta X, and kappa T, which drive the Dutch specific deviation from the European specific mortality model. So these capture how does the Netherlands deviate from the global trend that we capture, the global behavior and the global trend that we capture across these 14 countries. And then the same for Belgium here at the bottom. Okay. So in the calibration procedure, yeah, 3 steps if you want. So first of all, do a Lee-Carter at the European level and get the AX, the BX, and the KT. Second step, if necessary, do a small extrapolation of the KTs. And then the last step, run another Lee-Carter, now for Belgium or for the Netherlands, and fix what you already calibrated for Europe. Yeah? And so the only known part to calibrate in this last step is the Dutch or the Belgian specific deviation from this European model. Yeah? And the result of that, you see it here on the screen. Maybe questions, if any? Any comments? Anything that's not clear? So I got a question. Jonathan, can you put your microphone on?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes,
it should be okay.
loud and clear.
So I had a question for the previous slides. It was about, no, next one. Yeah, it was about Belgium. If we see the estimation of alpha X and beta X, it's quite noisy.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it's due to the lack of data at lower ages. Yes or no?
Well, what is important here is, of course, that you also look at the scale at the y-axis. So where you see that you go way smaller in absolute value then compared to the range that you see here for the European level, right? So you see indeed that this deviation captured by this alpha X parameter for Belgium, that if you look at the range of values that this parameter can take, that it's way smaller than what is done at the European level. And so, okay, you say it's quite wiggly, or it's quite behavior is quite wild here. But do keep in mind that, yeah, if you would put this AX together with this alpha X, that you still would get a quite stable pattern here because of the small range that you capture here with the Belgian corrections on top of this AX. So the main trend is captured by this, or the main behavior here, age-specific behavior, is captured by this AX here.
Okay, but like, I had an additional question. My question was more, if you do the same for Iceland, for instance, where the population is really, really small, you are gonna have, I'm gonna guess you are gonna have something even more noisy than that. Is it really meaningful to do it for such small population, or does it make sense to take into account that it could have the same condition as, I don't know, Sweden or Norway?
Yes, good point. So then an additional point or comment that we have to raise here is that these are, of course, only point estimates. So you would have to set up like a bootstrap experiment or something to capture also the standard error or the uncertainty that comes with these Belgian-specific parameters. Now, for Belgium, that will still be okay, in the sense that we're currently running such bootstrap experiments for the update of the model that we're preparing. And then you'll indeed see that the alphas that you get here, and if you look at the confidence intervals that you get around these alphas, these are still pointing at, I mean, significant parameters. But of course, the smaller I mean, if you would do this then for Iceland or for a very, very small population, then of course, like you say, you'll have to see whether you can still estimate these country-specific parameters with enough, I mean, with whether the uncertainty that comes with these parameter estimates isn't blowing up essentially. So whether you can still, with enough confidence, give parameter estimates for very small populations. So it's something that you really have to evaluate for every population on which you want to use this model. Jonathan?
Yeah, okay, thanks a lot.
But not just with the parameters, but then also with the uncertainty that comes with it. That's, I guess, my main point as well.
And how exactly can you say the uncertainty is too high or too low? Or?
Yeah, then you would see, if you would have pointwise confidence intervals here, then you're going to see, are they really containing 0 or not? Can I say something about what I get, whether I should rather leave this parameter out of my model or not?
Okay, thanks.
Anything else? So that's a nice addition. So maybe I'll try for next week or as a follow-up to this class to show you the plots of the parameter estimates with the with the bootstrap confidence intervals added to them as well. We should also say that if you look into this multi-population mortality literature, this is of course not the only thing that you can do. like Jonathan gave the example of Iceland or Denmark or something, populations which are even smaller than Belgium. Well, there are, of course, articles and efforts in the literature where people really try to do something for very small populations. Yeah. So here I would say this Lilly approach that we take works and leads to meaningful results for Belgium, for Netherlands, but it always has to be evaluated for a specific population that you have in mind, whether it makes sense. Or whether you would need something that is even more designed for handling a very, very small population, for instance. Yeah. Anything else? Okay, so maybe a few extra observations. So what you see over here is that if I look at the KT, calibrated at the level of Europe with my Lilly model, then I get something which is really looking like a straight line, right? Like a linear trend. Whereas if we look at the same calibration period and we would do just the Lee-Carter model, for instance, for the Netherlands, using that same calibration period, and we get something that is, yeah, that is a bit more jumping around, right? So we already explained that last week, that this Lee-Carter model for a single population is very sensitive to the calibration period that you're going to use. And remember that I said at the end of last week's session that what is random walk with drift that we use to project the time-specific parameters in a Lee-Carter model, what that random walk with drift is doing is it connects the first dot over here from 1970 with the last dot over here and just draws a line and projects that forward. Yeah? And that's kind of the best estimate that you would get with your random walk with drift for a Lee-Carter model. And we also mentioned that it's super sensitive to the calibration period. Now, this is in fact, perhaps it's the most convincing reason to opt for such a multi-population mortality model, because now if you look at this behavior of the KTs, which we're also going to project with a random walk with drift setting, but what we get now at the level of Europe is way more robust. So it's way more robust to changes in the calibration period. So here for this lower graph, it doesn't matter whether we go from 1970 till 2015 or something, or whether we start in the 80s. This is a super stable trend that you're capturing at the European level. So that is very easy to project, and it's a very robust specification that you get over here, right? So this definitely helps with respect to this calibration, sensitivity to the calibration period, which we discussed for the Lee-Carter model. Yeah, and this, of course, has to be combined with Jonathan's question earlier on. So this European level trend is capturing, if you look at the scale of those KTs, this is really capturing the biggest part of our information. Yeah, and then the Belgian specific or the Dutch specific time trend is then a kind of a rather small correction to this trend that we capture at the European level. So robustness against the choice of calibration period, that's definitely an advantage of the Lilly specification at the European level. So let's think a little bit how we would project this time series model to the future. So what we get here is per gender, we have the KTs and we have the capacities calibrated at the level of a specific country, right? So if we look at the time series that we're going to use, then you recognize the random walk with drift at the European level, and you recognize for the country-specific deviation, you recognize an autoregressive time series model with order 1, right? Order 1 because we're here using the kappa t plus 1 as a function of the kappa t. And this is our autoregressive parameter, that's the A. And in order for this time series model not to diverge, this A parameter should in absolute value be smaller than 1. And this is something I will add a few extra notes on that later on via Toledo. But this is the specification that we want to use. We want to use the random walk with drift at the European level, and we want to use an AR1 process at the country-specific level. Yeah, and so the idea or the inspiration to go for this specific setting is that if you look at this European trend, you see that it's super linear. So you want to go here random walk with drift. And if you look at the country-specific deviation, so here the idea is that it sort of goes around this European trend. So it will go a bit away, it will return to this European trend, then move away a bit, and so on and so forth. Yeah? So it should return to this European trend. That's the idea. Yeah? Now, if you look at this specification, I'm gonna build a bivariate time series model here. So I'm gonna allow for correlation between the noise terms at the European level and the noise term at the country-specific level. And what may seem a little bit funny at first sight is that this data parameter, so the drift parameter for the European time series model, this drift parameter is country-specific. And that has to do with the way how we calibrate the model. Because what we're going to do is we're just going to use a bivariate setting. So we're going to use the calibrated time-dependent parameters at the European level and put these together with the time-dependent parameters of the country we're interested in. So if my focus is on Belgium, then I'm here going to use the kappas for Belgium, for females in Belgium, for instance. And then I'm going to calibrate this set of two time series specifications together, and I'm going to get a specific value being calibrated for the theta, for the drift parameter. But if the focus of another researcher is on the Netherlands, then he or she is going to combine these time-dependent parameters at the level of Europe with the Dutch-specific time series parameters, so the Dutch-specific kappas. And he or she is going to work with these bivariate time series and get a specific estimate for the drift parameter from there. Yeah? So it's not that I'm going to combine the European level with all the country-specific time series, country-specific deviations from this European trend. No, I'm only going to combine this parameters estimated at the level of Europe with the Dutch or the Belgium specific ones. And that is why this theta becomes depending on the country that I have in mind. Yeah. So that's a little bit peculiar. So like I said, we take the noise terms to be bivariate from a normal distribution with mean 0 and with a specific covariance matrix that I want to estimate. So this allows for correlations between both time series, so between the country-specific deviation and the European trend. And if you're going to do that, you can do that with techniques like seemingly unrelated regression. So that's kind of that is the maximum likelihood estimation approach to calibrate your covariance matrix. So the idea is that we're going to demonstrate that in a computer tutorial later on, next week or something. So we're going to see how that works out online. But that's the idea. We need to estimate this covariance matrix. We need to estimate the drift parameter. We need to estimate the AR1 parameter. And we're going to do that with maximum likelihood for this bivariate time series model. Yeah, so that's covered in the literature. We know how to do that. What if we want to use this model for forecasting? Then we're going to generate new noise terms from a bivariate normal distribution. And we can plug these simulated noise terms in here We can use the last observed or the last calibrated KT and kappa T. We can use the estimated parameters for the theta and for the A, and we can use those to generate new scenarios. Once we have the scenarios for the time-specific parameters, we can combine them with the age-specific parameters that we calibrated and put the whole leading model together to get new projections, to get scenarios for the future force of mortality and the future mortality rates. That's the idea. You see that being used over here. So this is my KT. This is my random walk with drift projected forward. I do that here for the Netherlands and for Belgium. So you see that there are two longevity fan charts put on top of each other. And the slight difference between the two is that, once again, because your drift term is country specific, and also your covariance term is going to be country specific. So it depends whether you're going to take the focus of Belgium or the focus of the Netherlands, and because that will determine, next to your European time series model, what will be the other time series model that you're going to use in your bivariate specification. And so there are slight differences between using it for Netherlands, using it for Belgium. That's what you see over here. And then here I get the AR1 model without an intercept for the Dutch specific, time-specific parameters. And here you get the same for the Belgian female time-specific capacities. And so that's what my AR1 model is doing. You will also see that in the long run, this AR1 process will go to 0 in the long run. So in the long run, you're kind of stipulating that the Belgian mortality will evolve to what you captured at the European level. One way to tweak that or to modify that a little bit would be to include an interceptor over here in this AR1 process. So this is something that we've been investigating, that we tried out, and which in the end we decided that this intercept term is in our experiments turned out not to be significant, so we left it out of the model specification. But it's something that you could put in and of which you could investigate, yeah, does it make sense to include it here or not? Okay, so this is what we, right, so let's continue. So what we did before the break is we introduced the Lilly model. We discussed how to select the European countries that we wanted to use to calibrate this multi-population model on. We discussed that we will fit, in fact, 2 Lee Carter models. So we will fit a first Lee Carter model on the aggregated European data. Then we're going to fix the parameters calibrated at the European level. And in a second step, we're going to calibrate another Lee Carter model that is then capturing the country-specific deviation from the European model, given that the European parameters, parameters calibrated at the European level, are kept fixed. Okay, and then a final thing that we discussed before the break is that we gave a bivariate time series specification that we want to use, and which is doing a random walk with drift at the European level and is using an AR1 process for the country-specific deviation, right? One of the things I mentioned is that initially we did this for each gender separately. So we did it for the male data, we did the same for the female data, right? If you look at how these publications by the actuarial associations evolved over time, then you see that in the more recent publications, so 2016, 2018, we're allowing for correlation between the time series models calibrated for female and for male data, right? So in 2014, we only incorporated correlation between the European trend and the country-specific deviation from this trend for males and females separately. So that means we were working there with a bivariate time series model. and required a bivariate distribution for the error terms per gender. These are the error terms coming from the model at the European level, the error term coming from the model at country level, right? But if you then look at here 2016 and 2018, then we also incorporated correlation between not only the European trend and then the country-specific deviations from the trend, but we did that for males and females together. So that means we were working with a 4-variable distribution using the error terms coming from the European model for males, the country-specific model for males, then the European model for females, and the country-specific model for female data. So that's a kind of evolution that you see in how this multi-population standard was developed. Okay. How can we use this model to generate scenarios for future mortality? So how can we do that? Well, we want to run future scenarios here denoted with I. We want to run those for periods T, running from the most recently observed time period till a certain horizon that we want to specify, for instance, 2050, 2060. And what we're going to do is we're going to start with the most recent parameter values for the KT, the KT max, and the kappa T max. And so that is for the European model, that is for the country-specific deviation from this model. We're going to estimate the time series parameters for our time series model, our bivariate or our 4-variate time series model. So we're going to fix these time series parameter estimates, and then we're going to simulate error terms to get the future values of these time-specific parameters. Right? So that is our starting point. Then we're going to combine these future values for the time-specific or time-dependent parameters. We're going to combine them with the fixed age-specific parameters that we calibrated both at the European level and at the country-specific level. And by putting them together, step number 1, step number 2, we'll get a scenario for our future force of mortality in period T, where period T is in the future, or our mortality rate in the future, in a future year T, right? So that's what we can do. And that is nothing that's not different from what we did for the Lee-Carter model, for a single population. And the only difference here is that we're thinking in 2 parts. We have a specification at the European level, and we have a specification at the country-specific level, right? Now, something that I want to say, that I want to explain at this point, and which we already slightly touched upon last week, is that how can we close these scenarios that we generate? How can we close them for old age mortality? So what you see here on sheet number 29 is again my Canisto mortality law, which we used earlier on for old age mortality. And now I want to combine, or I want to use this Canisto law for each scenario I, and for each future year T, right? So that's how I want to apply it. And I'm going to calibrate this Canisto law on a certain set of ages, say from 80 to 90. I'll get a parameter value, phi1 and phi2, which is specific for year T and for scenario I, right? And using those parameter values, I can then close my mortality scenarios. I can close them for old age mortality. Yeah. So let me take a moment to explain that with the iPad a little bit with some more details. So let's change for a moment the Lee specification. So that's my Lee mortality model specification. Okay. which tells me that if I need the MXT for country C, then I'm going to get it by doing MXT at the European level and multiply it with a country-specific deviation from this mortality model at the European level, right? So that means if I explicitly write down my Lee-Carter models, I get something like this. Okay. So this is what I need according to my Lee model specification. And now I want to use this as a scenario generator for future mortality. Okay, so what I say is that then I should go for getting future values of my KT. Yeah. So my KT is coming from the specification that I have like this. And a future scenario, yeah, this should be the kappa T. So the difference is not so clear in my notation, but I mean here the kappa T. And this is my AR1 process. Okay, so I need a future values of both the KT and the kappas, where T is beyond the most recent observed period. Okay, that's what I need. I need these future values, and I'm gonna plug them in here. Yeah, use them in here for the values of my time-specific parameters. Whereas the age-specific guys, I will estimate them and keep them fixed because they don't change over time. Yeah? And the future values that I generate for my time-specific parameters, I can generate them by generating these noise terms, okay, and by using the most recent available values for the K and for the kappas. And that's how I can generate future scenarios or future values for those time-specific parameters. Once I've got my simulated values for the future use, then I can always translate them into future values for my Q. So I have a future scenario for the mu xt in a specific country, and I've got that for a specific scenario I, let's say. So I is my scenario and C is the country that I'm looking at. And my year T should be beyond my most recently available time period, T max. Yeah? So that can always be translated then into a similar scenario for the Q by using the connection that I have like this, right? That's my connection due to the piecewise constant the last step that I'm discussing in my sheets is then what happens for very old age mortality. Okay, so here what we're thinking about is what if we look at a new year of data? So this is, for instance, we go from 1970 up to say 2000, let's say 2020. So then we're going to look at 2021, 2022, and we're thinking of future years, future time periods. And we're going to go, for instance, from the year 0 till 90. And then we wonder, yeah, what's going to happen here for this very old age mortality. So what if we go from 91 up to 120 or something. So how should we do this for the future time periods, right? That's what we want to wonder. And we say we can use Canisto's law for that. We're going to apply Canisto on per scenario, yeah, per scenario, and per year, okay, and per gender, of course. And so Canisto will tell us, okay, you're going to use the data over here for one scenario that you generated there, and you're going to use that to calibrate the phi1 for I and T, and also for the gender that you're considering, and the phi2 for scenario I and future year T. And so I is for the scenario, and the future year, that's my T. Right? So that's what we will be working on, and that allows us to close each scenario that we generate for a future time period. We can close each scenario for very old age mortality and get a closed mortality table. That's the idea. This also motivates why we need to be able to quickly calculate these parameters in Canisto, because if we have a very lengthy procedure there, then we would have to repeat that for a lot of scenarios. So that would not be a very easy way to work with. So Jonathan has a question. Jonathan?
Yeah, my question was about the estimation of the parameters. Are we supposed to do it at European level or at country level?
For the Canisto, you mean?
Yeah, for the Canisto, sorry.
Well, you can do it for both, yeah. But the way we do it is it's at the country-specific level, because we want to come to these guys, right? We want to come to the queues over here, who are country specific, and it's these queues that we want to get in the end. But it's, I mean, you can also use it at the European level if your goal is to close the old age European mortality rates of data.
Okay, thanks a lot.
But our focus is typically on, we want to get something for Belgium, we want to get something for the Netherlands. We want to publish that, and we want to publish that up to the age of 120 or something. So that means that we're gonna do this Canisto with the country-specific mortality rates. Yeah. I saw somebody else with a question. Not sure who.
Yes, can you go one slide back?
In my handwriting or in the...
Handwriting.
Okay. I'm sort of losing the connection. Just a moment, Ansfried. I need to mirror. I'm mirroring my screen and I somehow lost it. Let me try to get that back. Maybe you can already ask your question while I'm trying to get my laptop back on my...
Yeah, it's just a writing question. Is it a T or a theta? I cannot see.
For that, so I'm trying to get my laptop back. I mirror my laptop, which is lying next to me. I mirror it to the Windows computer, and then I'm calling from the Windows computer, but the connection between the laptop and the computer dropped. So maybe one of the other participants can already clarify this question. Not sure if that would be possible.
Normally it should be a C, because there isn't any theta.
So you're looking at, can you ask the question again?
Yeah, in the second scenario, generation of future mortality, then you have a KT equals KT plus, what's that? I couldn't read it.
That's the theta, so it's the drift parameter. So that's my theta, but it depends on C because of the way how we calibrate the bivariate or the four-variate time series model. So it is a theta with as the superscript a C, and it seems like I'm back. Okay, so it is, we go back over here, and if I understand you correct, it's about this guy here.
Yes.
So that's the theta, so it's the drift parameter in my random walk with drift specification, and it is country specific. That's because I'm going to calibrate these two guys together, so it depends on which country that I use over here as the second entry, if you want, or the second dimension in my time series model.
Okay, thanks.
All right, any other questions? If not, then I'm going to go back to the sheets and discuss the last part of it. So we now have our scenario generator put together. Here you see again the graphs that we already discussed when we were discussing Canisto. So the idea is that you can use this Canisto idea to close any scenario that you create for mortality in the future. So in a future year T, you can close any scenario for old age mortality by using this kind of thinking. Just keep in mind that the Canisto parameters should then be calibrated for each year T and for each scenario I that you want to consider. So that's important. Okay. So maybe some graphs, some results of this Lili model, calibrated for different European countries in this case. So what you see over here is that I selected 4 countries. I did this whole idea for the Netherlands. We did this for Belgium, did this for France, and for West Germany. We use here age 24, age 45, 65, and 85. So the labels that I have at my y-axis are a little bit disturbed. If you look at the paper that we have on this whole idea, then you will find the exact labels for the y-axis over here. What you see in red is a Lee-Carter model. So what if you do a Lee-Carter on the Netherlands, a Lee-Carter on Belgium, a Lee-Carter on France, on Germany? How does that work? And what you see in blue is the result of the multi-population approach, right? So what we see here, if we look at Belgian data age 25, French data age 25, then we see that the Lili definitely is picking up the trends in the data in a more careful way there, because we combine the European idea with the country-specific deviation. So that seems to work well. Do keep in mind that at age 25 we don't observe a lot of deaths, which makes it not so easy to estimate and to project the mortality rates at these ages. But Lili brings us definitely an improvement here compared to the Lee-Carter setting. So that's one advantage. Another advantage is, like we already said, that it's way less sensitive to the choice of the calibration period compared to doing a single Lee-Carter model. Yeah? So these are the checks that you can make. You can also do that in the form of a backtest. So what I'm doing here is I'm looking at the mortality rates, in this case for age 0 and age 65. I'm not going to use all of my available data, but I'm going to limit my calibration period up to the year, let's say 2000 or something. Then I'm going to forecast, so build a Venn chart to forecast the mortality rates into the future. And then I'm going to evaluate whether my observed mortality rates are lying within this Venn chart or not. So you see that the backtest that we that we visualize here for female data and using the Legume model, that performs quite well. I mean, we see that we reach realistic scenarios in this backtest. And the same applies for the period life expectancy. Remember that the period life expectancy, that you can also use that in a kind of backtesting format, because you can say, okay, I observed the data up to the year 2000, and now I'm going to make a Venn chart with possible scenarios for this period life expectancy into the future. And I can, of course, compare whether the period's life expectancy that was realized in a specific year, in this case 2000, 2001, and so on and so forth, whether that lies within the Venn chart that I created. So putting up such a backtest, that's one of the checks and one of the instruments that you will use in the modeling process to evaluate whether the scenarios that you create, whether they are biologically reasonable, because if you would have strange jumps in plots like these, then you're in fact generating scenarios that are not biologically reasonable, right? And evaluating the out of time performance of your model, that is always, that's also a good idea to evaluate, to check in the model building process. So here you see some instruments like these being put together. Then I include the period and the cohort life expectancy projections. So this is if I apply this whole idea to Dutch data, Belgian data, French data, German data. I select here the female data, age 0, age 65, male data, age 0 and age 65, and you get the forecasts in terms of period life expectancy, cohort life expectancy. You get them over here. So we already discussed graphs like these earlier, right? Okay, so that's what I wanted to say about this multi-population mortality model of B&B. And what I would like you to do now as a follow-up to this class is to have a look at the two references that I list over here. So that's my own paper published in the European Actuarial Journal on producing the Dutch and Belgian mortality projections, the stochastic multi-population standard. And then the most recently available, the most recent publication by the Actuarial Association in the Netherlands, which is using the same methodology and which also puts a nice paper together in English, which you can access over here. Let me just show you where you can find these papers if you are on our Toledo site, and then we'll still have some time for some remaining questions. So if I switch to my screen.